different user. So next up that we have created this token, we want to create a way that our middleware can then be checking for this session ID next, because we'll be passing our session ID in header. So we're going to be passing it like this. If we want to make a request, we'll take our session and put it in a header. So for example, if this is an authenticated route, we'll give it an authorization header and then pass it our auth header that will be needed. So how do we implement a way for it to check on each request if the request header is present, and then it will then deserialize the user and put it on the request object? So to implement that, I will need to create something called another middleware, but I'll create it up here. So this auth middleware, it will be something that will be used to check for the presence of the auth header. So I'll call it auth middleware.ts. So we're just creating a new file, and then in here I will want to just implement first. The first middleware will be a middleware called the auth middleware, and the next one will be the is authenticated middleware, the one that will be set up to check if the user is authenticated or not. First, what we'll need to do is I will need to import my session model, because for each auth token, the token is stored in the session database. So we're gonna deserialize it from there. So models/session, that's where my session, this one is. I'm using axis models. And also I want to show you something here with TypeScript, is that there are some interfaces you can import to tell exactly when you're just creating functions that are gonna be used at request middlewares. You can import these interfaces from Express. So this now that I'm creating it, I'm gonna export a function, and this function is gonna be called the auth middleware. In here it will take a request and then set the interface here. I will say it's of type request, it's just an interface, and then a response which will be of type response, so that I can get some IntelliSense. And next is just a callback function to tell us to invoke the next middleware. So it's just a function. So in here I create this, and now I can, so this auth middleware, it will sit in between some requests, and as it's in between this request, is gonna be able to find a particular session if the authorization header is specified. So for our session, to deserialize this, we'll find one session, and find one only does finds it once and then exits and then just returns. So in here I'll check from the request dot header. It's a function that takes the name of the header to extract data from. So want to extract the authorization. So in here I'm extracting our authorization header. From the authorization, the data, that's the token, that's if it is present. So if it's found one here, then I will want to populate, because it's a reference. So we'll populate our user. So that is, in here we had a user here which referenced a user, but all this was, when we created this, we only created it with a simple ID. We kept an ID here. So if we want to populate and get the user in our auth middleware, we have to call this populate, and it will populate the data for that user there. And then next up is that I want to, after populate, I would like to then exec. This exec, instead of passing a callback here, because we needed to populate this, it has another syntax whereby you can call, after you have done all your query parameters, you can call this exec and pass it the callback that you had to pass here. So in here I will call this execute, and then give it my callback here. So this callback will take the first argument is an error, and the next one is the found session. So this found session, if it's a found session, then I want it to just say a request.user. There's an object on the request called the user, and then we'll give it our found session.user. So we populated the user and we'll pass the request to the, we'll make, since this is a middleware, we can do some mutations on it, and one of the mutations is that we can set a user object on this request, so that all subsequent all subsequent functions that will be called will have the request.user on it. And then next, I want to just set up a simple something called a simple boolean value here called is authenticated, which I will set it to say true. But if else, if everything, if not alright, then I want it to just set our request that is authenticated to false. While if and then also set the request.user to null, and then just call the next function, the next middleware. Also here too, I wanna, if it works, then I wanna like just call the next middleware. So far that we have done, checked all of this. Next is that I will just wanna export another function here. I remember I wanted to create two, this one, so this one is called is authenticated. This is a middleware that will be used to check like if the user was successfully authenticated or not. So is authenticated, it takes a request which is of type request, and next is a response which is of type response, and a next which is of type function, just like the first one, which is a callback. And then what we'll have is that we can check if request that is authenticated then if it is authenticated, then I want it to also do something like check if it's authenticated is equals to true, and request.user dot underscore ID. So if this request.user underscore ID is present and authenticated is true, then it means everything went fine. It means we'll return back a next to call the next function on the middleware of the middleware. But remember, this is authenticated, is not part of this request because we created it like this. So it will be better if we'll set it as like this, because we'll just want our compiler to be happy, so it will extract it like that. But else, if not like that, then we'll just say maybe we'll console.log of 401 here to just also for debugging stuff, and then we'll return him something like res.status and set it to 401, and then send just nothing. You know, we can just send nothing, so that we'll just terminate it, so it will not call next because the user is not authenticated, so that the route is protected. It requires authentication. So how do we make use of this middleware? First of all, this first part of this middleware will be on our, before each and every request it can check it. So in here I can say app.use and then pass in the auth middleware that we use there. So we're gonna first import it. So I'm gonna import auth middleware, but first let me just do like this, dot middleware. So if I come here, I can get my IntelliSense. So in here I can get the auth middleware, and then in here I will say auth middleware, which is a function that will be passed as a middleware here. But remember that our auth middleware is always checking for the request authorization, but we only want to make a request to the database if the current user was authenticated, has the request authorization header. So, but we can just leave it like that if we want to. And then our other part of the is authenticated is gonna be made use of in our routes here. So for example, our me here is protected. We can just use, like, say, we'll import the is authenticated, we'll import is authenticated from here, and then in here this one takes some request handlers. Our first handler will be our authentication middleware. So I will say is authenticated and pass it there. So let's check what this is doing here. What this is basically doing here is, first handler is authenticated handler, which is this one. We take a request like a normal this one, and if it's authenticated, it will call the next function. So if it is authenticated, it will call this function. But if it is not authenticated, it's not gonna call next. It will terminate the response and then send him a 401 telling him he's not authenticated. So we can actually give it the message, say let's say a message authentication required. So in here, if we'll do like that, then we can also test this route. Remember, this route was currently not protected, but now that it's protected, we can just use our authorization. So in our Postman here, I will first restart my app, and then after I restart my app, in my Postman here, remember we already set up our authorization header to the current sign in. We did sign in there, and now I can use this token that we sign in with and make a request to this user. And then we can see that me called. It means we successfully called this part. But what if we send a wrong authorization header, for example, like this? I just made changes to that authorization headers, or let me just, to be more clear, I can just take this, copy this, and then change it to something that is not in the database. And we can see that we sent a wrong authorization header. So when we're making this request, it was not able to deserialize the authenticated user from the database. And we can see the message here saying authentication required. It means we didn't pass our authentication. But so if we return this back, our token back, and send it, we can see it successfully called it.